Hi everyone, welcome. My name's Juniper Muller. I go by they, them pronouns. I'm the president of Melbourne Bisexual Network, and I'm here with Megan today to talk all things bisexual.
Hello, I'm Meg. I use they and she pronouns, and I'm also here with my 9-week-old baby who's currently feeding. So we're hoping that they will be feeding and snoozing, and it's very nice to be back.
So good to see you, Meg. We're talking tonight about maybe talking about bi people and families and fertility and having babies and things, because this is all very timely for you. I thought maybe if I could start with kind of how bisexuality has come up for you or not come up for you in your recent parenthood adventure.
A very good question. I feel like it's something which can feel, as often it does with bisexuality, quite invisible in the process of pregnancy and birth and parenthood as well. I think it struck me right at the very beginning when I first was first visiting the GP to say, hey, I'm pregnant, and figuring out what to do next, and that my details got passed on to the hospital, which was the women's hospital, which again I don't identify with as a genderqueer human. So immediately you're thinking a lot about your sex as opposed to your gender, and not really being seen as a queer person. And on my notes, it really struck me that my doctor put me down as a heterosexual woman. And I was like, oh, that really kind of punched me in the gut a bit, because I don't identify with either of those things. Like my feelings around womanhood are quite complex, and definitely not heterosexual. I've never been heterosexual. And again, these assumptions that were made because I'm there and I'm pregnant, as though like how this has happened, it must be between a man and a woman, which again is a very wrong assumption to make. And just immediately feeling kind of deflated about it, actually. I think just that I was just like, oh, I felt very quickly that this was going to be a process where it would be quite complex to be seen how I see myself, and also not knowing if I would have the energy to advocate for myself in those spaces, because it's such a vulnerable and kind of just a very exposed time, and I've never done it before. So it was, being there as a total novice, and just immediately feeling that was quite challenging. And I'd say that was my beginning feeling about that whole process. So
Pregnancy can be such a vulnerable time anyway. You're putting a lot of your trust in medical professionals, you're kind of interfacing with medical systems, but it's also a time where you're interfacing with some of where the gender binary and the heteropatriarchy are absolutely at their pointiest. That's how I kind of reflect on it. And if bisexuality is a challenge to the kind of heteropatriarchy, nuclear family, like clean lines dividing categories, which we defy, it's hard to maintain that defiance or that fluidity or that refusal of the gender binary in the face of, I don't know, electronic medical records and things like that.
And kind of the energy it takes to do that. I think it's, like you say, I think being visibly and openly bisexual is not something that you do once. It's kind of like a way of living your life. And it can take a lot of energy just to show up with all those nuances. And I think as a genderqueer bisexual, I'm like, it's hard to show up as those parts of myself in all spaces all the time. And I think, it really dawned on me in these spaces where I was already feeling quite uncertain and vulnerable, that it was even harder to show up with those complex parts of myself. So it's almost like you feel like you have to simplify it down to what my sex was, and just the fact that I was a person who was pregnant. That would, I've never been ladied more than the last year of my life. I don't think I present much as a lady, but there's something about being pregnant which immediately everyone's like, lady. And even if they look at me, and often I felt there was a lot of confusion of, you look like a girl who looks like a boy who's pregnant, and I can't understand that as a concept, that I still would get ladied. I'm like, so strange. But it's fascinating, the assumptions people are making about you in those spaces, like what kind of person you must be. And it's even about my partner. Like, my partner could be any number of different genders. but the assumption was that it was a man and a cis man. And yeah, even that, I feel like there's a lot of just, again, a lack of nuance in how people think about these things and how people perceive families to be, because families can be so many different things.
The other thing that kind of comes up for me is that your bisexuality or your gender shouldn't really change, I don't know, like the medical care or how an ultrasound works or advice around, I don't know, specific nutritional needs or things during the pregnancy. Like, it's actually not that big a ask from a practical view to say, actually, gender me correctly or be inclusive of my sexuality. It's not rocket science. It is socially major.
And I say in the entirety of my care, there were only 2 occasions on which I was asked anything to do with my gender or pronouns. And partly, like I say, because I wasn't in those spaces asserting that loudly, because I just didn't feel like I had the energy to do that. But yeah, to find that only twice was it ever considered. And I also think I'm someone who presents more like what people expect a non-binary person to look like, because I don't present exceedingly femininely, and but even with that expectation of what non-binary looks like, which is ridiculous to start with, but people still weren't thinking about that or checking in with me about it. And I think, again, that kind of, just left me feeling a little bit, again, disappointed that that was something I had to shout about in order for it to be heard. It wasn't something that people were ever thinking about.
Right? Like, this is in progressive Melbourne, in 2021, that that's what the situation is. And depending on where you are in the country or where you are in the world, that these things can really vary. We're still probably a pretty long way away from people being that gender inclusive, especially in places like the maternity ward or gynecologists or all of that sort of family planning, family support stuff. Yeah.
And how about you? Where would you like to begin in terms of your experiences around family and babies and children?
I don't have kids of my own yet, although maybe in the future. But I actually became a sperm donor at the start of this year. And the process kind of involved in becoming a sperm donor and also storing sperm for myself is a heavily gendered process and a heavily normative process in terms of the assumptions that they make about who is interfacing with their service. But I'm non-monogamous as well, and asked for a separate session to have, so they do mandatory counselling before you become a sperm donor. And I said, oh, look, actually, I'd quite like a session with each partner of mine. And that was quite useful, but the poor counsellor had no idea what to do with this, really. And that in terms of actually going in and making the donations, they also are really, perhaps without going into too much detail about it, really assume what would be the materials that would help you create the sample as well, and didn't really ask at all about that, because that's totally it's like really a super desexualized process and really medicalized process, at the same time as in some ways being very sexual. Like, you're having an orgasm in order to create the sperm sample. So, oh gosh, honestly, it was a pretty strange process. And in terms of how my bisexuality was involved with that, again, kind of like not really given space to express that, not catered to in a direct kind of way.
Just almost as if people would almost be like mind boggled if it were to come up. I find that one of the fascinating things. It's just like, if you were to say it, people are like, there's this kind of shock of, you're not gay or straight. Like, there is still such surprise of that space in these spaces. And I find that so interesting as well. It's just like, oh, bisexual. As though, like, what bearing does it have? But, well, it has bearing on all of my life, because I'm always bisexual. So it's, again, like, it's supposed to just disappear in certain spaces, because obviously in this space you're just this one part of that, not the whole complex, all of it.
It's partially because with bisexuality, it's like the only way you know someone is bisexual is by them saying, I am bisexual, or like sharing their internal experience. Whereas heterosexual and homosexual people feel like confident in just whoever my partner is a demonstration of the important bit of my sexuality because of being monosexual. Um, so to be bisexual, you have to bring it up because it's not assumed, and then people will say, well, why are you bringing it up? Like, why is that relevant to your ultrasound?
Yeah, and it, like you said, it's that you have to assert it in these spaces. But again, it's almost like these things are often about sexuality, yet again, you're supposed to not bring that in. And it's strange if you want to bring it in, and it's strange if you want that part of yourself to be seen or validated or any of that. And it's like, but yeah, because this is about my sexuality, and it's sexual in certain in certain ways. And again, it's always that kind of like, well, it's slightly awkward that you want that to be considered. And so I think for me, and most of the way through this, I've kind of not brought that in with me in an explicit way. It's been something that's always been with me, but hasn't been very visible or seen or validated. And yeah, it's added a very kind of a sad and tricky layer to an already complex, tricky process, actually. Definitely, it's been complicated it in ways that not necessarily I didn't expect, but it has added many layers to the experience for me, definitely.
Meg, I'm so sorry to hear that, and yeah, parenthood, especially the first time round, can often be a really really tough time, really isolating time.
Oh
Yeah.
yes. Holy moly! It's I feel like I'm quite a real, like, I'm an optimistic realist, but it has been mind-boggling in ways. Just it's
Yeah.
a whole lot in a whole lot of directions, and incredible and awful and all of the things in between. I think definitely,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I'm seeing it, your little baby reaching their hand up to say
yeah.
hello. And we were talking just earlier about the idea or the phrase of gaybies, as in children of gay parents, or like queer families, and what does queer families mean? And especially as there have been way more access to IVF or other kind of pregnancy options. Plus, I guess, like queer people have had babies and children for a long time in lots of different ways. Um,
Yeah.
this idea of gaybies has kind of come up a bit more in recent years, especially as the kids conceived via IVF for same-sex couples have like grown up and started to tell their stories. And I wanted to, kind of bring up and ask you whether you think kids who have a bisexual parent or bisexual parents have a unique experience.
It's been on my mind a lot, actually, that idea of, like, what makes a family queer, and what parts of that are going to be important for my child, and how that will impact them in different ways. Because particularly because of the kind of stuff that I do and advocating in this space, I'm not a quiet bisexual. I'm not necessarily a screaming bisexual, but it is an important part of my life, and something I talk about, and something that I would definitely be talking to them about in all these ways. And I'm hopeful that it will mean that they have a lot more space to be themselves in whichever ways they choose. And my partner's incredibly supportive of all this as well. And yeah, I view that my family is queer because I'm queer. So I'm a queer parent with a child. So inherently, my family is queering the norm in lots of ways because of the ways that I experience my gender and sexuality, and also the ways that I experience the world. Um, and yeah, I think there's that tricky dynamic I feel with seeking out queer family spaces, as well as that fear always of wondering whether I'll be welcomed. Because again, if people see me and my partner, the assumptions that are made about us might be that I'm not queer or that we don't belong in those spaces. And again, those feelings of what privileges we have because we've been able to have just a bio kid. And I think again, there's a lot of lack of thought about the different kinds of queer families because I'm in some spaces online with other trans folk, and there's
Mm.
this beautiful thing that lots of queer folks can have bio kids and lots of queer families can have children in different ways, and that's like magical and awesome. And I mean, we're enormously privileged that we've been able to do that, but a lot of other queer families can too. And again, this always feeling that it's one or the other rather than the complexities of it. I feel a bit sad about that sometimes. So I'm kind of hopeful that I'm going to be welcomed into queer family spaces, and I'm definitely going to go to them and see and hope for the best. And I think as an optimistic bisexual, hoping that I will be welcomed into those spaces, and that as a family we'll be welcomed into those spaces as people are becoming a bit more thoughtful and just
Mm.
aware of some of the tricky complexities of being bi and how we haven't
Mm.
always been welcomed. And I do think there's a great awareness of that. So I remain optimistic about it. And yeah, connecting with other queer families, I think, is something I'm really seeking and something I'm finding a lot of joy in, actually.
I want to reflect. Actually, when you said earlier on that you're looking forward to your child hopefully feeling affirmed, like there's possibility in terms of them exploring their own sexuality or gender as they grow up. Um, Modeling that kind of pride or openness can be, yeah, such a powerful and really cool thing to be able to offer as a parent. In thinking about, I guess, like parenting spaces, like going to a play group or being involved in a support group, or I don't know if you did like birthing classes or things like that are sometimes pretty heavily gendered. Sometimes it's like there's one element of it that might be ourselves feeling welcome or not welcome, or queer enough, not queer enough to enter a queer space. But then there's also the question of if we have a cis straight partner, will they be welcome? Like will we be welcome as a package deal because we come as a
Yeah.
family, like as a couple? Or will only I be welcome as a queer person, as a bi person with my baby?
It's a really interesting question as well, isn't it? Because I believe strongly that we need to have queer spaces which are just for queer people, and particularly in terms of safety and just history. And I also know that my partner being a cis het human, there's a man as well. Like there's a lot of reasons why people might not want him in those spaces, and that much as that I want there to be spaces where we can be welcomed as a family, I also understand that that's not always going to be simple, and that there will be some spaces, that it's not always appropriate for him to be in. And I'm hopeful that family spaces will be more thoughtful about the fact that we are a family, and there's times when we'll come as a package deal. And I also think there's a time and place for me to be in those spaces with my child, and for that to be about that part of my identity and how that impacts our world as well. Because yeah, I think there's not a simple answer to that. And I think there are times and places for both to be fully welcomed and to have parts of our life not necessarily need to be taken into those places all the time either. Because yeah, just because I know he's a safe, thoughtful, wonderful ally doesn't mean that that's what everybody else knows about them as well. So it's complex. So is that something you feel like how have you experienced that in the spaces that you've been in so far?
I haven't experienced it so much because both of my partners are queer women, and I guess just because of the the types of circles that we tend to interact with, but I can imagine it might be complex in the future. I think it's sometimes also tricky to think about. Like I've got other extended family members and cousins and brother and things who have kids of their own, and many of them cis and straight and having kids in their 30s and things. That's beautiful, so supportive of that, but reflecting on what my experience of parenthood might be like, and how that might have some similarities but also some like pretty major differences in terms of how I might want to do parenthood according to sort of my queerness, my gender, my sexuality, the communities that I'm involved in, and how we do family in queer community.
There's that lovely difference, isn't there, often in what family looks like for queer folks, and something I'm really so grateful for and very excited about as well for my child, that they're going to get to grow up surrounded by a beautiful, colourful queer family. Particularly given that my blood family is on the other side of the world, and who knows when I'm going to be seeing them anytime, maybe not anytime soon. So I'm also enormously grateful for the people around me, and I hope that I just see that as being like, I can't imagine what it would have been like to grow up being surrounded by, expressive, proud queer folks, because that just was not my experience, and I just think how different life would be having that. So that's something that I'm really excited for my child to experience, and yeah, just to see all these different ways to be a human and not feel like there's one option, which is much more kind of how I grew up, feeling like there was a right way to be a woman. And even if it didn't feel good, that was what you're supposed to do. And I also just hope that for them, they won't have to think so much about all these things as maybe as we have had to think about them, because they're still so complicated. I kind of hope that they won't need to come out or explain themselves in all these ways. They'll just be able to be themselves.
There is the part of parenthood that's conception, and whether that's IVF or otherwise. There's a part of it is like the hospital experience and how you're marked down on the forms and things. There's a part of it that's like interfacing with or kind of relating to family or friends or community. There's also the industry of parenthood, right? Like advertising and marketing and nursery stores and clothes buying and I don't know, like pushes and things. And I think about or by people presented as healthy, happy, responsible parents, whether it's in movies and TV shows or in like advertising. And I really can't for the life of me think of many examples other than maybe Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, but even that actually was a lot of complicated things with the characters that's by there.
I know some people who are bi who have families, but again, they're assumed to be straight or gay, depending on their partner. Like you say, once you become the family, even more that's embedded so much more in this group of people you come with, and that has an immediate bearing on who you are, and there's no more complexity to it than what people see.
Because kind of like Hollywood myths around bisexuality is liars, hypersexual, or like insane serial killer, untrustworthy, duplicitous sort of thing, dangerous. That all of those myths and sort of negative biphobic stigma things are kind of like the exact opposite of the archetype of a good parent. Like the archetype of a good parent is not at all sexual, or sort of like the exact right amount of sexual within the context of marriage, but you don't want to think about mum and dad having sex and all of this kind of thing. Plus, like reliable, trustworthy, safe, all of these things that are just like the opposite of the bisexual stereotype. The other thing that I guess like I'm seeing maybe much more of now with this kind of recent, and I would say like last 5 years, rise in bisexual representation, in bisexual identification, or multi-gender attraction, kind of being open about it. It's really focused around young people, and young people being like under 25 often, or maybe under 30, um, which many of them are just like not having kids yet. And that's fine, but it's really youth focused.
Yeah.
And so um, we don't yet have that many role models like in our direct face-to-face community or in our online communities, certainly not in TV or Hollywood or movies like that. And so yeah, it was a complicated time in history to be thinking about, well, who do we look up to as bi parent role models.
And that who is out as a bi parent, because I'm sure there are so many, but not people who are talking about it, and particularly those who are in relationships where people assume that the people are heterosexual. There's that we just don't know, and I think that again, there's that part of me wants to be talking about it a bit more, because I want people to realize that there are lots of bi parents, and but yeah, it's not, this feeling always still of bisexuality as being inherently overly sexual in all these ways that gay and straight people aren't. But no, it's
Yeah.
just that we're not any more or less than anybody else. So sometimes I think someone's like a bisexual parent feels like an oxymoron of sorts, doesn't it? It's like, oh, but you can't be bisexual and a parent. It's like, well, you can, and I am.
Thank you so much for joining me, and I'm excited to meet again sometime to have some more conversations going deeper on bi plus topics with you on the wonderful and amazing Bent TV. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.